It began, as most human contradictions do, with a sermon, centuries before the engines of industry roared and the stock tickers sang their hypnotic rhythm. The idea of greed was simple, a sin, not just any sin, but one of the 7 deadly ones, the kind that corroded the soul and condemned it to eternal ruin. Priests warned against it, poets cursed it, philosophers dismissed it, and yet, in the shadows of cathedrals, markets were already whispering another gospel. In medieval Europe, money was not just a tool, it was a moral test. To lend for profit was to invite damnation. To hoard was to distrust divine providence. The world was divided neatly between salvation and sin, between those who prayed for grace and those who bartered for gain. Yet, as trade routes stretched and coins clinked across the continent, something subtle began to shift. Human needs started to speak louder than heavenly fear. The merchant, once a figure of suspicion, became an unavoidable presence. He was neither knight nor priest, neither peasant nor noble. He lived in between, morally ambiguous, economically necessary, and though theologians branded him with contempt, society could not function without him. Every loaf of bread, every bolt of cloth, every pilgrimage to Rome depended on his transactions. The merchant was the sinner the world secretly needed. It was an era when morality still claimed dominion over money, but the walls were cracking. The church preached ascetic virtue, yet it built basilicas funded by indulgences. The poor were taught that greed was evil, yet the faithful were encouraged to purchase their salvation. It was a magnificent hypocrisy, the kind that only human civilization could perfect. In the ledger of heaven, sin and necessity were learning to coexist, but history has a perverse sense of irony. For every sermon denouncing greed, there was a banker quietly counting beneath the altar. The Medici of Florence, the Fuggers of Augsburg, families who transformed loans into dynasties, sins into systems. Their ledgers became scripture for a new religion. Profit. If salvation was eternal, profit was measurable, and in a world increasingly obsessed with calculation, measurability was divine. By the 14th century, money itself began to take on an aura of inevitability. You could condemn it, but you could not escape it. Like a shadow at noon, it followed the human soul everywhere it turned. Cities like Venice and Genoa thrived not because they were holier, but because they dared to translate sin into structure. They invented double-entry bookkeeping, the art of balancing guilt and gain. One column for debit, one for credit, one for sin, one for salvation. And perhaps that's where the true genius of capitalism first appeared, not in the marketplace but in the human mind. For what is greed, really, if not a rebranding of hunger? The desire for more food, more comfort, more control, had always been there. Religion merely called it vice, commerce called it vision. By the Renaissance, the old world was fracturing. Paintings began to celebrate human ambition instead of divine humility. In Florence, Botticelli's angels gave way to bankers. In Antwerp, gold replaced relics. Artists were now funded not by faith, but by fortune. The moral universe inverted itself. Where humility once ruled, aspiration now reigned. And yet, the irony deepened. The same society that condemned avarice now relied on it for progress. The same priests who forbade usury now borrowed from the very lenders they condemned. It was as if civilization had collectively decided to sin just more efficiently. Let's be honest, humanity never abolished its moral codes, it merely outgrew them. The sin of greed was simply too productive to die. Every act of innovation, from the first joint stock company to the global banking system, has been driven not by virtue, but by appetite. We like to tell ourselves stories of noble entrepreneurs and visionary builders, but beneath every invention lies the same primal whisper, more. Perhaps the most tragic and brilliant transformation in human psychology occurred when greed ceased to feel sinful. We began to see it as rational, necessary, even noble. After all, who could argue with results? Greed fed the hungry, built cities, and drove the engines of exploration. It pushed ships across oceans and merchants into unknown worlds. It created wealth, and wealth, we convinced ourselves, was the ultimate proof of divine favor. In this new gospel, God rewarded the industrious and punished the idle. Prosperity was not a temptation, but a sign of grace. This moral inversion marked the true birth of capitalism, not when the first stock exchange opened, but when the human conscience surrendered, when we learned to call selfishness ambition and exploitation efficiency. It was not an economic revolution, it was a linguistic one. The irony, of course, is that we still pretend to be conflicted about it. We condemn corporate greed even as we invest in it. We decry inequality while checking our portfolios. We are, all of us, heirs to a paradox, the civilization that rose by moral compromise. Greed became not merely tolerated, but aesthetic. The gleam of gold, the symmetry of ledgers, the elegance of financial order, these were the new icons of devotion. The banker's desk replaced the altar, the market bell replaced the church bell. And in this secular cathedral, humanity found its new faith, perpetual growth. But every faith demands sacrifice. And capitalism, as God, the god of accumulation, required offerings more subtle than blood, time, labor, anxiety, and the slow corrosion of empathy. Yet we paid, gladly. because to refuse was to be left behind, morally pure, but economically irrelevant. By the dawn of the Enlightenment, greed had completed its metamorphosis. It no longer hid behind confession. It stood proudly in public squares, dressed in the rhetoric of progress. Philosophers like Bernard Mandeville even dared to claim that private vices create public benefits. A scandalous idea, and yet it fit perfectly. After all, if sin could build cathedrals, why couldn't it build economies? Thus the world moved on, propelled by the energy of contradiction, a civilization that justified its hunger with its own success. The church had once promised salvation in the next life. Capitalism promised it in this one, and between those two promises, humanity built its destiny. In the end, the transformation of greed was not a story of moral decay, but of adaptation. Civilization, ever pragmatic, found a way to reconcile its conscience with its cravings. It learned to baptize its vices in the waters of progress. And so the sin that once damned souls became the virtue that powered nations. A convenient miracle born not of divine grace, but of human necessity. Because the truth is simple and merciless. We didn't conquer greed, we cultivated it. When morality met money, it is tempting to imagine that money and morality have always been enemies to great forces locked in eternal opposition. One seduces, the other restrains. One builds empires, the other condemns them. Yet, history rarely honors such simplicity. When morality met money, they didn't destroy each other, they married. And like all great marriages, it was complicated, transactional, and quietly dependent. The story begins in the Reformation, a time when Europe tore itself apart over salvation. For centuries, the church had served as both moral compass and economic regulator. It dictated what was sinful to earn, what was acceptable to spend, and what was holy to give. But when Martin Luther nailed his theses to the church door, he wasn't just attacking indulgences, he was, unknowingly, deregulating the moral economy. Luther's message that salvation could not be bought had unintended consequences. By stripping the church of its monopoly on forgiveness, he also stripped it of its control over commerce. Suddenly, faith became personal, and profit became permissible. The Protestant Reformation, for all its spiritual idealism, unleashed an economic revolution. The believer no longer needed a priest to mediate salvation or a confessor to justify his earnings. The soul could now balance its own books, and nowhere did this new theology of labor flourish more powerfully than in the writings of John Calvin. Calvin's Geneva preached discipline, thrift, and industry virtues that, when stripped of their theology, became the DNA of capitalism. Work was no longer a curse from Eden, it was a calling. Profit, no longer a sign of sin, became a hint of divine election. If you prospered, perhaps God approved. If you failed, perhaps you deserved it. This was the moral revolution that capitalism had been waiting for, a faith that sanctified accumulation. We often remember the Industrial Revolution for its machines, but its true engine was psychological, the conviction that virtue could be measured in productivity. Yet even then, the relationship between money and morality was uneasy. The wealthy feared damnation, the poor envied salvation. Societies tried to draw lines between acceptable ambition and destructive greed, and, predictably, those lines moved whenever the economy demanded it. In times of scarcity, thrift was praised. In times of expansion, consumption became patriotic. By the 18th century, money had ceased to be a private affair. It was now a social force, the bloodstream of nations. Empires justified conquest as commerce. Colonies were not plundered, merely developed. Trade routes became moral missions, carried out in the name of progress and civilization. It was moral language masking economic appetite, the oldest camouflage in human history. And here lies the great irony. Morality did not restrain money, it legitimized it. The bankers of Amsterdam, the merchants of London, the shipowners of Lisbon, they did not see themselves as villains. They believed they were serving God, country, and progress. They were, in their minds, moral actors. They simply redefined morality to suit the market. This, perhaps, is the quiet genius of civilization, its ability to turn contradictions into ethics. When exploitation becomes inevitable, it is renamed opportunity. When inequality becomes unbearable, it is reframed as meritocracy. And when greed becomes universal, it is baptized as growth. The Enlightenment only sharpened this paradox. Philosophers began to speak of rational self-interest as a virtue. Adam Smith, that soft-spoken moral philosopher from Scotland, gave greed its most respectable disguise, the invisible hand. He did not glorify selfishness, but his readers certainly did. They heard what they wanted to hear, that by pursuing personal gain, one might accidentally serve the common good. A convenient philosophy, tailor-made for merchants and monarchs alike. Thus, morality and money achieved their final reconciliation. What had once been sin became science. What had once been confession became policy. The pursuit of wealth was now compatible with virtue, so long as one paid taxes and donated occasionally to charity. It was a grand illusion of balance, the idea that greed could be managed, directed, civilized. But beneath that civility, something darker stirred. The psychology of money had begun to shift from fear to entitlement. Where the medieval soul trembled at the thought of avarice, the modern man demanded return on investment. The marketplace became a moral compass of its own. What succeeded was right, what failed was wrong. The profit motive replaced divine commandment. And yet, even in the age of enlightenment and empiricism, the human heart remained unchanged. We still sought meaning through accumulation. We still measured worth by wealth. We simply invented nobler justifications for doing so. In every great city from London's financial district to Amsterdam's canals, churches stood beside banks, cathedrals beside exchanges. It was as if civilization wanted to remind itself that heaven and profit were still neighbors, if not quite friends. On Sundays, men repented their greed. On Mondays, they called it ambition. As money grew abstract from gold to paper to credit, morality grew flexible. Invisible wealth required invisible virtue. If the soul could no longer see the coin, it could no longer feel its weight. The ledger replaced the conscience, the accountant replaced the priest, and in this quiet transfer of authority, the modern financial mind was born. What emerged was a society not of sinners and saints, but of investors, calculating, disciplined, convinced of its own righteousness. It was not that people became less moral, they became more managerial. The question was no longer is it right but does it work? Utility became the new theology. By the dawn of the 19th century, capitalism had achieved what religion never could: global unity. Its creed was simple: accumulate, expand, repeat. Its apostles were merchants, engineers, financiers. Its miracles were railways, stock exchanges, and empires. And its moral code, stripped of sin and sanctified by science, was efficiency. Yet, even in its triumph, the old fear lingered. Somewhere deep in the human psyche, the voice of the confessor still whispered, "Is this righteous?" To silence it, we built narratives. We called tycoons visionaries, colonizers explorers, monopolies enterprises. We cloaked greed in genius, and genius in philanthropy. The 19th century man no longer sought forgiveness, he sought legacy. If morality could not restrain money, perhaps fame could redeem it. The endowment replaced the confession. The museum replaced the altar. And so, morality survived, not as a guide, but as a decoration. That, perhaps, is the ultimate irony of financial history. Every age thinks it has tamed greed. Every generation believes it has found a moral capitalism, and every time the market proves otherwise. For morality and money, like lovers bound by mutual dependence, cannot live apart. Morality gives money its legitimacy. Money gives morality its relevance. Together they build civilizations, and together they corrupt them. So when we speak of capitalism's virtues, we are really speaking of its justifications, the elegant fictions that allow us to desire without guilt, to profit without confession, and to believe, against all evidence, that we can be both moral and rich. Because in the end, the union of morality and money was never holy. It was, as it remains today, a contract of convenience, signed not in blood, but in profit. The birth of a moral paradox at some point in the 17th and 18th centuries. The world made a quiet deal with the devil and then convinced itself it was doing God's work. Greed, once a mortal sin whispered in the confessionals of old Europe, began to rebrand itself as ambition, prudence, and innovation. The transformation was neither accidental nor entirely cynical. It was a philosophical pivot, a rewriting of moral vocabulary to accommodate the new rhythm of the modern economy. What had once been condemned as avarice was now praised as industriousness. What had been viewed as gluttony for gold became enterprise. But how did this sleight of hand occur? The answer, as usual, lies in the collision between theology and trade. When the Protestant Reformation shattered the spiritual monopoly of the Catholic Church, it also loosened the moral constraints that had bound economic behavior. The Calvinists, in particular, brought with them a new austere interpretation of success. To work hard, to profit, to accumulate wealth, these became signs of divine favor. Poverty was no longer a virtue. It was a symptom of laziness, of moral failure. This subtle psychological shift from guilt to justification was the quiet revolution that capitalism needed. Thinkers like Max Weber would later call this the Protestant ethic, but in truth, it was far more than an ethic. It was a new cosmology. It taught that human desire could serve a divine purpose, that the pursuit of self-interest might somehow enrich not only the individual but also the entire community. In short, greed was sanitized, moralized, and weaponized. Nowhere was this clearer than in the emerging financial centers of Amsterdam and London. The merchants who once prayed for forgiveness before counting their coins began to see themselves as architects of a greater system. The market became their cathedral, the ledger, their scripture. In the ports and coffee houses of the 17th century, the air buzzed with a new kind of faith, not in heaven, but in the invisible hand of human exchange. Greed was no longer a vice to be suppressed, but a force to be harnessed. The moral paradox of capitalism was born. It was an elegant justification. If each person pursued their own enrichment, society as a whole would prosper. Adam Smith would give this paradox its most enduring formulation in The Wealth of Nations 177 writing that it is not from the benevolence of the butcher or baker that we expect our dinner, but from their regard for their own interest. The line has been quoted endlessly, sometimes admiringly, sometimes despairingly, but its psychological implications are profound. Smith didn't just describe the market, he redefined morality around it. Under this new logic, greed wasn't just tolerable, it was necessary. A world without self-interest, it was claimed, would stagnate. The promise of profit became the engine of progress, innovation, and even civilization itself. What had once been condemned as selfishness was now reframed as the natural order of human behavior, the raw material of prosperity. And so, the moral vocabulary of Europe evolved. The language of the church gave way to the language of the market. Sign became inefficiency. Virtue became productivity. Redemption came not from confession, but from investment. Salvation could be measured in interest rates and dividends, but even as this new creed spread across continents, unease lingered beneath the surface. For if greed was now a virtue, what did that make of compassion? What became of charity, humility, and restraint? The philosophers of the Enlightenment tried to reconcile these contradictions with talk of rational self-interest, but the tension remained. The more society celebrated profit, the more it needed to disguise its costs. Behind every gleaming stock exchange was a shadow. The slave trade that financed it, the colonial exploitation that fed it, the anonymous laborers whose sweat greased the gears of progress. Yet the moral system of capitalism, this new theology of productivity, made it easy to look away. Greed had become invisible, because it was everywhere. To question it was to question the very structure of modern life. It is in this moral transformation that the true psychology of greed begins to take shape, not as an emotional impulse, but as a collective delusion. Greed, we are told, is simply human nature. It is what drives us, defines us, sustains us. To deny it is to deny progress itself. This idea has proven astonishingly resilient. From the spice traders of the Dutch East India Company to the stockbrokers of Wall Street, the same self-justifying narrative persists. I am not greedy, I am efficient, I am not exploiting, I am innovating, I am not taking, I am earning. This is the genius of capitalism's moral rebranding. It turned desire into duty. And with that transformation, the emotional tone of greed changed. Once associated with shame and secrecy, it now wore the mask of respectability. The wealthy no longer hid their opulence, they flaunted it as proof of virtue. Palaces became testaments to productivity. Opulence was redefined as aspiration, but beneath the surface, the psychology of greed retained its old hunger. The difference was that it now operated under the banner of growth. Growth became the secular synonym for salvation. Nations competed to grow, corporations vowed to grow, and individuals were told to constantly upgrade their lives, all in the name of progress. Yet no one seemed to ask, growth for what? To what end? The paradox deepened. The more society worshipped growth, the more it required inequality to sustain it. For greed, by definition, is relative. It thrives only when there is someone to envy, someone to outdo. Thus, capitalism's moral system contained within it the seed of perpetual dissatisfaction. We are told to admire the rich, not for their morality, but for their success. We are told that envy is corrosive, yet entire economies depend on it. The marketing industry, the financial sector, the speculative markets, all function by manipulating the same primal emotion that medieval priests once warned would damn the soul. And so, the transformation was complete. Greed had not been destroyed or suppressed. It had been domesticated, intellectualized, and institutionalized. It became the silent ideology behind our daily transactions, invisible, yet omnipresent. When you buy a stock, when you check your savings, when you measure your worth against another's, you are, in some small way, part of this centuries-old moral compromise. In the end, the rise of capitalism was not just an economic revolution, it was a spiritual one. It required humanity to rewrite its moral codes, to sanctify what was once sinful, and to redefine what it means to be good. And the result? A civilization that believes virtue can be quantified, that morality can be monetized, and that greed properly managed can save us all. A dazzling paradox, indeed. The machinery of desire. By the time the 19th century dawned, greed no longer needed to hide behind moral justifications or religious rhetoric. It had become a structural feature of civilization itself, an unspoken law humming beneath the machinery of modernity. Factories belched smoke like mechanical sermons, railroads carved ambition into the landscape, and money, that most abstract of human inventions, began to move faster than the hands that earned it. The Industrial Revolution didn't merely produce goods, it manufactured a new kind of human psychology, one that measured virtue in output, worth in accumulation, and happiness in ownership. The idea that greed could be harnessed for collective good was no longer just philosophical theory, it was an operating system. And nowhere did this system flourish more vividly than in the great financial cities of the 19th century, London, Paris, New York. They weren't just centers of trade, they were temples of a new faith. Their architecture, marble banks, towering exchanges, iron bridges spoke the language of power and permanence. Yet the creed was simple. Desire must circulate endlessly, like blood in an empire's veins. This was capitalism's true innovation. It learned how to convert private longing into public prosperity. If a man wanted a carriage, someone had to build it. If a family dreamed of finer clothes, a factory had to produce them. If a nation desired expansion, steel, and ships, entire industries would rise to serve that hunger. The more you wanted, the more the system thrived. The market, we were told, was the great mediator turning greed into growth, want into work, appetite into progress. But desire is not a stable fuel. It must always be stoked, refined, and redirected. Enter the age of advertising, the new priesthood of greed. Where religion once promised eternal salvation, advertising promised eternal dissatisfaction. Every poster, every pamphlet, every glossy catalogue whispered the same heretical gospel. You are incomplete, but we can fix you for a price. Desire, once a flicker of human ambition, became a permanent condition. It no longer mattered what one truly needed. What mattered was that one kept wanting. The industrialists of Manchester and the bankers of the City of London had learned the psychological secret that still governs financial history today. Greed doesn't have to be monstrous, it just has to be constant. The economy would do the rest. In this way, capitalism transformed itself from a system of exchange into a system of emotion. It began to engineer feelings, envy, aspiration, fear of scarcity, and to monetize them. A new kind of human emerged, the consumer, defined not by what they produced but by what they desired. And as the 19th century gave way to the 20th, this transformation became total. The world entered an era where the most profitable industry was not steel or coal, but imagination itself. The psychology of greed had become industrialized. Advertising agencies, financial institutions, and even governments joined in a silent alliance to keep the engine of desire running, whatever the moral cost. Stock markets, once tools for funding trade and exploration, evolved into arenas of speculation, temples where risk was worshipped and profit became prophecy. Men gathered on trading floors like gamblers before an altar, their shouts echoing through marble halls. They didn't trade just in goods, but in expectations, in belief. That belief, the belief that money could multiply itself, was perhaps the purest expression of capitalism's new morality. It turned the abstract into the divine. You didn't need to build ships or factories anymore. You just needed to believe in growth. But beneath this euphoria, the old tension persisted. For all its sophistication, the system still relied on one primitive truth: someone had to lose. Every boom required a bust, every fortune a ruin, every winner 1,000 quiet casualties. Yet the moral narrative of greed made these losses acceptable. That's the market, people would say, as if the market were a god whose will must not be questioned. The 19th century crises, the South Sea bubble, the panic of 1825, the crash of 1873, were not just financial failures, they were moral ones. Each revealed the same human flaw the medieval theologians had warned of: unbounded desire inevitably consumes itself. But instead of repentance, society responded with reinvention. The next bubble was always different. Greed had become self-replicating. By the early 20th century, it was no longer enough to accumulate wealth. One had to display it. The age of industrial tycoons, Rockefeller, Carnegie, Vanderbilt, turned the private vice of greed into a public spectacle. Opulence became a moral statement. If God had blessed them with riches, who could call it sin? And yet, beneath the grandeur of mansions and monopolies, a darker truth fermented. For every titan of industry, there were thousands of laborers crushed beneath the gears of progress. The moral paradox of capitalism had reached industrial scale. Greed enriched nations even as it impoverished souls. The labor movements, the strikes, the revolutions of the 19th and early 20th centuries were not just economic battles, they were spiritual rebellions. The poor were no longer content with promises of heavenly reward, they demanded earthly justice. And still, the machine of desire rolled on, relentless and Greed had evolved once again from personal ambition to systemic necessity. By the time the Great Depression struck in 1929, the illusion was complete. The world had built its civilization on credit, moral, financial, psychological, and suddenly, the bill came due. Markets collapsed, banks vanished, fortunes evaporated, the priests of profit were silent. And yet, the lesson was not learned. Instead of dismantling the temple, humanity rebuilt it, taller, shinier, more efficient. The financial history of the 20th century became a story of amnesia, every crisis forgotten, every sin rebranded as innovation. The gods of the market demanded faith, and faith they received. By mid-century, consumer capitalism had reached its most sophisticated psychological form. Governments encouraged spending as a patriotic duty. Citizens were told that to buy was to believe, to sustain the national dream. Advertising fused with ideology. The pursuit of wealth became synonymous with the pursuit of happiness. Greed was no longer something to confess, it was something to aspire to. The machinery of desire had become invisible, embedded in culture, in education, in the very rhythm of modern life. Even morality itself began to speak the language of markets. Efficiency, productivity, optimization. And so, the world entered the modern financial age with a collective delusion that greed, properly managed, could produce stability, that the invisible hand would always balance the scales, that markets, like nature, had a moral order of their own. But beneath that optimism, the same ancient truth waited, patient and silent. Greed, left unchecked, always devours its host. It is perhaps the greatest irony of all, that a civilization which once condemned greed as a deadly sin now depends on it for survival. We no longer ask whether it is moral, we only ask whether it is profitable. And so, the story continues, the story of a species that mistook its hunger for progress, its desire for destiny. The story of how we built entire economies not to satisfy needs, but to perpetuate wanting. The machine hums on, endlessly, because we have forgotten how to stop it. The empire of appetite. By the dawn of the 21st century, greed had shed its final mask. It no longer needed to pretend to be virtue, nor disguise itself as progress. It had become invisible, a default setting, a silent operating code written into every financial transaction, every corporate ambition, every personal dream of success. Humanity had not merely accepted greed, it had digitized it. Where once the smoke of factories marked the empire of desire, now invisible signals, data streams, algorithms, market indices, traced the new geography of power. The world no longer revolved around tangible goods but around speculation, derivatives, numbers that represented other numbers. We had entered the age of abstraction, wealth without substance, ownership without production, profit without purpose. This was not the old capitalism of soot and steel. This was its ethereal descendant, the empire of appetite, where greed floated freely through cyberspace, detached from any moral or physical anchor. The traders of Amsterdam had gambled on ships and spices. The bankers of London had wagered on gold and bonds. But the financiers of the modern age, they gambled on belief itself. They sold risk, insured uncertainty, and speculated on speculation. The global economy had become a mirror hall of confidence. As long as everyone believed the reflection was real, it would continue to shimmer. And belief, as history has proven, is the most dangerous currency of all. The early 2000s were a symphony of excess played in digital code. Wall Street, the city of London, Tokyo, Frankfurt, these were no longer cities of trade but temples of abstraction. Algorithms replaced traders. Speed replaced thought. A deal made in milliseconds could move billions of dollars, yet leave not a single tangible object in its wake. Finance had become pure psychology, the monetization of emotion, expectation, and fear. The irony was exquisite. Centuries earlier, theologians had warned that greed corrupted the soul because it made man believe he could control fate. Now, with spreadsheets and supercomputers, that delusion had become institutional policy. Banks believed they had conquered risk. Economists believed they had tamed the cycle of boom and bust. Investors believed they could predict the future. And then, as always, came the reckoning. The 2008 financial crisis was not merely a collapse of markets. It was the latest moral failure in a saga that had begun centuries before. The instruments of modern finance collateralized debt obligations. Subprime mortgages, credit default swaps were just new disguises for an ancient impulse to create wealth from nothing, to turn promise into property, to gamble with someone else's ruin. When the towers of confidence fell, millions lost their homes, their savings, their faith. But as history teaches with cruel consistency, the machinery of greed is self-healing. Within years, the same institutions that had caused collapse were reborn, stronger, more sophisticated, more unapologetic. The empire of appetite had learned its lesson not in humility, but in efficiency. The 2010s saw greed evolve yet again, this time into something transcendent, a force liberated from the old boundaries of nation, currency, or morality. Cryptocurrencies emerged, decentralized yet driven by the same feverish pursuit of gain. Stock markets soared, fueled not by productivity but by perception. And as digital wealth inflated to cosmic proportions, the old questions about virtue and vice became irrelevant. After all, who could moralize about greed when everyone was chasing the same illusion? Capitalism had achieved what religion never could, a universal faith without doctrine, a salvation without guilt. The investor, the influencer, the entrepreneur, each became a new kind of believer, preaching the gospel of self-made destiny. Risk, they said, is the price of freedom. And yet, what they really meant was this: greed is the cost of belonging. But beneath the glittering surface of this new digital Eden, the same psychological truths persisted. Greed had always been a paradox. It promises fulfillment through endless wanting. It creates wealth through scarcity, happiness through comparison, security through competition. In every era, it has demanded the same sacrifice: human peace of mind. Modern society is perhaps the most anxious in history, restless, ambitious, perpetually unsatisfied. Even surrounded by abundance, we feel poor, because our wealth now exists in a world where enough has no meaning. Financial history, when stripped of its statistics and jargon, is the story of this endless appetite, a hunger that consumes empires, markets, and men alike. And so, As we scroll through markets on glowing screens, watching numbers rise and fall like divine signals, we are reenacting an ancient ritual. The stock ticker is the new oracle, the portfolio the new soul. Our faith is data, our prayer is growth, but growth into what? That question, whispered through centuries of speculation, remains unanswered. Perhaps because we no longer dare to ask it. The 21st century's financial order, globalized, algorithmic, self-replicating, has created a kind of moral silence. The old debates between virtue and vice, greed and generosity, have faded into background noise. Profit is its own justification. The market decides, we say, as if the market were not a human creation, but a divine authority. And yet, in the quiet moments between booms and busts, the illusion trembles. Climate crises, inequality, digital monopolies, each reveals the cost of an economy built on unending hunger. The empire of appetite, magnificent though it is, devours not only resources but meaning itself. Still, humanity endures this paradox. We know greed is dangerous, yet we cannot live without it. We condemn excess, yet we celebrate success. We recognize the fragility of our systems, yet we continue to build them higher. Why? Because greed, more than any other force, flatters the human ego. It tells us that we can outwit nature, surpass morality, and even rewrite the laws of time. It promises immortality in the form of accumulation, wealth that outlives its maker. And though every empire of appetite has eventually collapsed, from Venice to Amsterdam, from London to Wall Street, the dream remains irresistible. Perhaps that is the final lesson of financial history, that greed is not a flaw in the system, but the system itself. It is not the corruption of human progress, but its reflection. And so, the question, what made greed a virtue, finds its answer not in philosophy, but in us. It was never about economics, it was about identity. For centuries, we have confused wanting with being, profit with purpose, expansion with evolution. And in that confusion, greed found its perfect disguise, not as sin, nor as virtue, but as truth. As long as we measure worth by accumulation, as long as we define progress by consumption, greed will remain the quiet architect of our civilization, the unseen hand shaping not just markets, but minds. And perhaps one day, when the last index falls and the last empire of appetite crumbles into dust, we will finally see it for what it always was, not the engine of prosperity but the mirror of our own insatiable reflection.